Hello and welcome to another episode of Voice from the Desert. This is Ariel again, and we're going to be continuing this motif that we started on last podcast. Last podcast, we were talking about if the spirit of the same spirit that resurrected Christ from the dead is in us. So we're going to be going with continuing with that motif. I know that I said that we were going to talk about the verses I use for prayer, but I feel led to go in this area. And for that, we're going to be reading in Galatians chapter 2, verse 20. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. In the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. To give it a little context, this is the Apostle Paul writing this, and it's basically him talking about a little kerfuffle that went between him and the Apostle Peter, because he saw Peter acting a little bit with some hypocrisy. See, there was this dispute that was going on in Christianity back then. The first Christians were mostly Jewish, so they naturally saw this as a continuation of their faith, of Judaism. And they had no intention whatsoever to expand and branch out Christianity to the whole world. It wasn't until persecution happened that forced them to go out of Judea and go to Samaria and other neighboring nations and keep spreading the gospel. Now, what they originally thought is that, well, okay, so this is for you guys as well? Cool. But you're going to have to follow our rules. Like, you're going to have to go through our stuff, and that meant Jewish law. Now, there were others that got the revelation, including said Peter that we're talking about, that was not the case. Like, God called them as were, and they just had to follow Christ, and whatever after that, that's between them and God. So Peter was one of the first people that got ministered to that, without going into very specific details about that. But Paul was the one that was being sent to the Gentiles. He was being sent to all the people all around the world and preached the gospel in a manner that was more open. I mean, Paul always went to the synagogues all over Asia and Europe, wherever he went. He always made sure that the gospel was first preached to the Jews. And when he saw that there was no avail, then he went to the Gentiles. He always made it a priority to preach to the Jews, since they already knew the law, they already knew the prophets, they already knew what was the written word up to that point, what we all know now as the Old Testament. He always made a point to go to them and preach the gospel to them first, and then go to the Gentiles if there was no response from the Jews. So Paul was very invested in the Gentiles, the people who are non-Jewish believers, because they were his go-to. There was the main focus of his ministry. And there was a dispute back then in the context of when this letter to the Galatians was being written. And it's the reason why Paul is writing this letter to the Galatians, because a certain section of Christianity, so you can tell that division within Christianity is not something new or 500 years old. It's been since the inception of Christianity. A group of Jewish Christian believers wanted to force the believers to live out the Jewish laws. So they were imposing circumcision. So they were making sure that if you want to be a believer in Jesus, you have to perform circumcision on all the males. And Paul was adamant against this, because one of the rules that the Council of Jerusalem came across when this issue came about what we're going to do with the Gentiles, or the non-Jewish believers, they totally removed the burden of living out the law, and they said that they only have to accept Jesus and try to live to not live an unmoral life, and to refuse to eat from anything that was dedicated to idols or strangled meat. Then after that, you're good. So there was a group of Christians going to Galatia, forcing them to circumcise, saying, like, if you don't circumcise, you are not going to heaven. If you don't do this, so basically imposing stuff that was in the law, mind you, but Paul is making clear that this promise of the law was specifically for the nation and the children of Israel. And that alone there teaches you a bunch of things. There's certain things that is written in the Bible that doesn't necessarily mean that it is for everyone. So basically context is key. So Paul was making it clear to the Jewish the non-Jewish believers in Galatia, like this does not apply to you. The circumcision does not apply to you. So going back with Peter, Peter was in a meeting where there was groups of both sides, the non-circumcision and the circumcision group. So what happens? The circumcision group had this hoity-toity attitude towards non-Jewish believers, and the Jewish custom is that you do not mix with non-Jews because that would not be kosher and you will be declared unclean. So before these circumcision people arrived, Peter arrived first to this gathering and meeting, and he was mingling with the Gentiles, the non-Jewish believers. He was mingling with them. Paul was there, and Paul was already accustomed to this kind of action, so there was no issue with Paul. So they were all interacting, all well and good. Then all of a sudden, the ones that do believe in the circumcision and had this little issue with the non-Jewish believers came about, and Peter immediately retreated to the side of the other ones, like kind of acting with hypocrisy, like I was good while these people were not here, but since now they're here, they might snitch me to the other people back in Jerusalem, so I'm going to pretend that I'm actually one of you guys where I leave these other guys alone. So Paul seeing this, Paul confronts him, and he's like, okay, so you want to live like a Jew, but yet you mix up with us. So he called him out in public. He put his stuff on Front Street. So why Paul is being so confrontive about this? Why is this so important for Paul to jump in and like berate Peter about this? So he was like, well, I have been, and we go now here with verse 20 that we just read, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. So he was like telling Peter, look, whatever criteria, and you got to put this even into deeper context. Paul used to be a Pharisee, and that meant a whole lot. Peter was just a fisherman. So he wasn't even a religious. He had, other than being a Jew, he had no deep religious affiliation to his religion other than him being a Jew, which at that point in time, if you were a Jew, you already had religious affiliation by birth. Paul was a Pharisee. That means that he studied this. Like if anyone had any reason to show up and enforce laws on people, it would have been Paul. It would have been Paul. Paul would have been like, yo, you want to take this to the extreme. You be looking at the real one. You should be looking at me because I'm the one that was persecuting y'all. I was the one that was persecuting all you Christians. I'm the one that was chasing you around all about. And while I was doing so, that's when God chose me and picked me up while I was doing that. So, and Paul's like letting him know, that part of me that used to be so gung-ho about this kind of stuff, it's dead. He said, I was crucified with Christ. And it's no longer I who lives, but rather Christ is now who lives in me. So we're continuing this motif of death and resurrection. Paul is saying here, like giving it like a broader sense of what real Christianity is. And I brought the context in order for it to be clear of what Paul is talking about, but it also applies to a lot of different areas in our lives. Like there can be positions that we lost, that we've held for a long period of time, that we thought this as our secure place, or the place where we lay our flag, and this is the hill we die on. And Paul was like, Christ is my hill to die on now. I no longer live for what my opinion is. I no longer hold on to religious ideologies that are divisive. It's all about Christ now. It's all about Christ in me. It's all about Jesus. It's all about him now. So I now submit. So in the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. So he is now obsessed with living for Christ. It comes to a point in our lives as people who believe in Jesus. And if this is not your case, then it's not your case. For us who believe in Jesus, it is our desire, it is our heart's desire to please him, to be fully pleasing him, to that he has shown us, to show him the gratefulness that we have for his sacrifice. And what he has done in our lives is unpayable. We can never pay him back. We can never do enough that will reward such blessings and peace in our lives. Well, he thought that he was doing God a service back in his old life as a Pharisee, persecuting Christians, unaliving them, separating them, men and women. He didn't care. But he had that encounter with the living God, and that changed his life to the point that he can say, I am now crucified with Christ. Now, that expression alone, like, we think about crucifixion because we know the story of Jesus, and we don't give it the weight the word crucifixion meant back then. We don't have that cultural context of what being crucified is. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but it doesn't go wasted. I'm mentioning it again. Being crucified was the lowest of the lowest of the lowest of punishments. Like, that was reserved for the worst of the worst. And we're talking about times where people had no morals, like they had no qualms about anything. This was like, there was no buffer. Like, nowadays because the whole world is basically Christianized, it has some sense of morality, some sense of right and wrong. Back then, there was no such thing yet. Even them had a limit, and for them, being crucified was the lowest of the low. Like, you couldn't go lower than that. Like, that was reserved for the worst criminals, and you had to commit the worst crimes. That's why Pontius Pilate did not want to kill Jesus via crucifixion, because okay, I got no qualms about getting rid of the dude, but I don't think what he's done qualifies to be crucified. Like, I don't think the punishment fits the crime. I mean, he's a little troublemaker, and that's why he flogged him. That's why he scorched him. He goes like, okay, well, he's going to die eventually. I mean, we beat him up pretty good. Give him some time, he'll die eventually. I mean, look at him. That's why he said, look at the man. Here's the man. Like, I beat the daylights out of him. I beat the brakes out of him. Look, he's pretty much done. And they're like, no, crucify him. I was like, I don't understand you people. Why are you going to go this far? So, and I'm making this emphasis so we can understand the context of what Paul is saying when he says, I am crucified with Christ. He's saying, like, I humble myself, because we got to understand also the crucifixion, and this is not just reserved for Jesus. This is reserved for anybody that was crucified. You were crucified on your birthday suit. So there was no loincloths. They do that out of, respect, because nobody wants to see that image. But the reality is, that's how he was crucified. So not only are you going through the worst death that was imaginable back then, you're also being humiliated by being crucified in your birthday suit. Paul is telling Peter, I'm humiliated, I am dying the slowest of death, and I'm doing this with Christ because Christ paid that type of price for me. I will do so the same with anything that is against him. So I will be dying with Christ in my ideologies, in my frame of thought, in everything. So he's taking the reality of what happened to Jesus, because it is an historical fact that Jesus was crucified and was killed by the Roman Empire. It is a historical fact. So he's taking the fact of what happened to Jesus and using it as a sort of a metaphor, and also spiritually speaking, saying that I have been crucified with Christ. So it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. So he's saying, me and Jesus went to the death. And it's the same way as he rose from the dead. Now, it is not Paul that's coming back from the dead with Jesus. No, Paul died. Paul died on that cross as well. But now it is Jesus who's taking Paul's space. It is Jesus who's being resurrected in Paul. And that is the perfect metaphor to establish true Christianity. True Christianity is that the slowest of deaths has to be applied to my ego, my way of seeing. The Bible says that my thoughts are not your thoughts. And the Bible also says that trust in the Lord and do not lean on your own understanding. So you have to do a lot of removing and a lot of things getting out of the way. And we won't willingly give up those things because we identify that as part of me. Because guess what? It is part of me and part of you and part of all of us. But exactly those things are the ones that have to die in order for Christ to be born in us. So to conclude, are we being crucified daily? As Jesus said, pick up your cross daily and follow me. Are we being crucified daily? Are we crucifying our flesh? Are we crucifying our way of thinking? Are we crucifying our way of seeing things? And are we submitting to the will of Christ? Because if we declare ourselves to be believers in God and we declare ourselves believers in Christ, we have to give up that old way of seeing and acting and doing. We have to submit ourselves to the will of God, to the will of Christ. So that is my conclusion for at this moment, to remind you that we are crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who should be living, but Christ in us. So thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. I hope that this has blessed your life in some way possible. And just wish that all of us would understand what is to die to ourselves and let Christ be reborn. God bless you all, and take care.